Hello and welcome to live programming at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to be dealing with three issues. These are issues that I've been wanting to deal with, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do a long-term, put together, produced video on these. I just don't have the time. There's too much happening this week. So the three issues we're going to cover today are the Trump tariffs, Xi Jinping being sort of installed as president for life in China. Okay, I shouldn't use that title. Anyway, Xi Jinping installed as a ruler for life in China, and also this Saudi nuclear issue, which is truly frightening. So all of these issues are things that if they develop further, I may end up doing a produced video about, but I wanted to talk about the developments over the past week because it's really important. The most recent one is in the past couple days, you've probably been hearing a lot about Trump's new tariffs. Trump is starting a trade war. Trump this, that, and the other thing. And as far as I can determine what it is, what he's claiming he wants to do is smack a 10% tariff on aluminum and smack a 25% tariff on steel imports from everywhere. So a lot of the discussion of this, and there is good discussion of this and why it's a bad idea in a lot of mainstream media, but a lot of it's sort of looking at it from an economics, sort of Econ 101 approach. And I don't think that really does a great job of describing why this is such a bad idea. This is actually one of those instances where it is so simple and so basic that, yes, I think the Econ 101 approach does make sense. If you slap tariffs on steel and make it more expensive, that means every product produced in the United States with imported steel gets more expensive. So it's probably going to be bad for consumers in that sense. But generally, this sort of economics focus of looking at policy has never made that much sense to me. It's always struck me as a bit reductive. I think our study of economics is fascinating, but we really don't know as much as we think we do about it, or as much as we pretend to know about it. I think if the last 10 years in the global economy will teach you anything, they'll tell you that. I think we've got a couple tools that kind of work. It's kind of like medicine. Economics today is kind of like medicine in the 1800s. It's like we've got like a couple tools that we know kind of work, but we really have no idea what's going on. So just taking this sort of regimented, well, this happened here, you know, this input went in here, so this is going to come out here when we're talking about trade or economic policy, I think is always very limiting. And I think I've got a better way of looking at this. So it's possible. I tend to lean free market. I tend to generally listen and agree with the trade architecture people when they're putting something together. But I think there's space for reasoned arguments and discussion about these issues and what they really mean for the economy. I don't think that Trump has done that in the past week. I think he's done the exact opposite. And I'd like to describe why this is problematic, not in terms of economics, but in terms of narrative, in terms of history. I've got a sort of mini theme that I've been developing in the back of my head for a while. It's a sort of narrative always trumps data. Narrative always beats data. It's you know, whether in investing, in anything like that, it's the story that's important. That's why I'm more focused on history than I am on economics. And looked at in that frame, in the frame of sort of long-term changes to the story, I'd actually argue that Trump's tariff stuff looks worse. This is something that they are covering well, but I think is worth emphasizing. Trump and some of his defenders are talking about how, oh, you know, all presidents do this, all presidents do something like this, you're blowing this out of proportion. And I think there is some truth to that, but it's limited, because what Trump is suggesting, and it's important to note at this point, so far, Trump is only suggesting this. We don't know if this is like the no trans people in the military thing, which he said, tweeted out, and then Mattis and the Defense Department were like, yeah, we'll take that under advisement, and it never happens. That'd be great if that was what was happening with this Trump tariff thing. Well, I mean, it would still be really frightening that we have some lunatic tweeting out policies that don't exist, and he's our president, but it would be great if this went away, but it seems like the general estimate is that tariffs is one of the few things that Trump actually believes in. And he is sort of, he's always presented himself, even back when he was a pro-abortion, pro-gun control Democrat. He was always presenting himself as a trade hawk. So it's quite possible that he's sincere about this, but it's important to mention that nothing has happened quite yet. So he wants to smack these tariffs on. So he wants to do this. This is something he wants to do. And it is significantly worse than anything that has been done before. He's using I can't recall the exact piece of legislation, but he's using a national security excuse that hasn't been used since 1981. So he's using a tool in trade that predates the current trade system. It predates the WTO negotiations of the 90s. The last time this sort of national security blanket excuse was used in such a way, the world was completely different. Like our real, more, now we have real trading partners. I mean, back then in the context of the Cold War, I mean, we had differing degrees of vassals. The idea that anybody in Europe would have really stood up to Reagan on a trade issue like that. Actually, that may not be completely accurate. But what I'm saying is that the power differentials were so very, very different back in the 80s, the last time this was used. And by using this sort of national security excuse to throw tariffs on stuff, it is opening the door for everybody else to do that with any industry. To say, okay, something as basic as steel is national security related than anybody else. So this rationale that has been used does tremendous damage to the trade system. That's one thing that's new and different and bad. The thing that this is most directly compared to are the Bush steel tariffs of, I believe, 2002 to 2003. That's kind of interesting personally. Like for me, as I've discussed elsewhere, I think after 9/11, I was I never described myself as a Republican, but I was pretty much down for anything that, the conservatives and the Republican Party wanted to do. And it was actually, for me, that was the point, actually, when Bush slapped on those steel tariffs, was the point where I was like, oh, wait a second, these Republicans are full of shit. So that's sort of an important point. Yes, to some degree, what Trump is doing here is comparable to what Bush did back in 2002 to 2003. But it's also, you should remember, there was an incredible outrage over that, and those tariffs did not last more than a year. It was a really, and it's pretty universally seen as a dumb thing that he did. And what Trump is proposing is worse. With Bush, our NAFTA partners were exempt from that. Other partners throughout the world were exempt from what Bush did. Trump just applying this to everybody. Trump talks a lot about going after China, but if you actually look at how the market works, this tariff action on steel imports to the U.S. is mostly going after Canada because Canada produces the most steel that goes towards us. So what Trump is doing is worse than what other presidents have been doing, and that's the important thing. So that's been covered well. What Trump is doing is worse. But what hasn't been covered as well is what I was talking about earlier with the Reagan thing. The fact that the world has changed dramatically from when Reagan was president, when Reagan was doing these things. And it has changed dramatically from the 15 years since George W. Bush was able to throw those steel tariffs on. It's important to remember that in 2002, I mean, we were the post 9/11 juggernaut. I mean, people were terrified of what we were about to do, what we did do in Iraq. Everybody, we're all Americans now. I mean, you'd hear that everywhere. Gosh, you'd hear that in Tehran circa 2002. So, you look at that space where we were universally seen as attacked and, still the leader of the free world or whatnot. And what Bush could get away with in that context was a lot more than what the United States can get away with in 2018. So we've got this trading system, this worldwide trading system, which we built, which we established the rules of. And what Trump is doing here is undermining it spectacularly. Even if, as I hope, none of this comes to fruition and it all just sort of gets forgotten. The stock market keeps going down and Trump's like, just kidding. Even if that happens, he's already done a great deal of damage to the international trading system, which once again, the US established, and like keeping this trading trading system going, for decades or a century to come, that's the long-term basis of U.S. power. The long-term basis of U.S. power isn't spending another $1 trillion on a weapons system that's going to be obsolete by the time we're actually fighting again. The true base of U.S. power is these norms, these systems that we built, that we put together. And the fact that Trump is sort of pissing all over them is dumb, really, really dumb. And you don't need to, believe in, economics witch doctory to look at that. You just have to look at the story of institutions and narrative and history to see that. Okay, so I think that's the boring bit I'm done with. I think we are finished with trade for the moment. We're going to move on to the second and third parts of this that should be a little less boring. Does anybody have any specific questions about the trade stuff I just did? Does anybody have any specific questions on trade? Wait, Martin Pierre is here within 10 minutes of the start of the live stream. That's good. The tariffs will help U.S.'s situation to stop North Korea. That's actually a great question from Acid Black Nerd. The tariffs will stop U.S.'s situation to stop North Korea. Of course they won't. They have very, very little to do. I mean, maybe, 3 or 4 orders, you could find a connection there. But that's what's so frustrating about the justification that Trump is using for these tariffs. He's using a national security justification that, if you did 4 or 5 steps, you could maybe say it's a national security issue. But you went 4 or 5 steps, you could say the fact that I just burped is a national security issue. It's not really connected to anything. So yeah, I'm sure there's someone in the Trump administration who's cooked up some way. I think the theory is that we don't produce enough of our own steel, so we can't build our own jet fighters, which is ridiculous. It's the Canadians that actually, and the U.S. that produce a lot of steel. Also, just generally on this sort of trade, China has stolen our manufacturing. That's actually not true. That's actually complete hogwash. What China has stolen are our manufacturing jobs. And it's not just China, it's also a sea of technological change. I'm not sure if this is still true today, but it was certainly true within the past 5-10 years that manufacturing year on year had never actually gotten smaller in the United States. It just never has. Manufacturing employment, because of robots, because of outsourcing, because of this, that, and the other thing, has, shrunken immeasurably. It's gotten much, much tinier. But the United States still produces much more stuff industrially than folks in the Trump administration pretend. Another question. Yes, Martin Pierre Fournette, our Canadian, is annoyed about these tariffs against Canada, which is fair. Oh, gosh. Logan Cool Extreme says, Wilbur Ross has walked back on this statement. Will this still do damage? I saw that tweet this morning. That was kind of fascinating. Yeah, I think I retweeted it. Wilbur Ross says, yes. Now, Wilbur Ross, the Department of Commerce guy, is an insane trade hawk. He's one of maybe 2 or 3 people in Trump's administration who agree with Trump on what he says about trade. Most of the people, that's another thing, most of the people in the Trump administration think his trade policy is crazy. But Wilbur Ross, so there was a tweet talking about Wilbur Ross says, someone asked Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, about what Trump had said. And Wilbur Ross says, yes, that is what it seems that he's saying. So I think that's a great indication of just how little Trump's own administration can trust what he says and does. But I do think, as I said, I think that trade hawkery, being a trade hawk, being someone who wants protectionism and really wants to worry about the trade deficit, that is that and the other thing. That is one of the few things that we can say with confidence that Trump actually believes and has believed consistently for quite some time. So I'm less cool about that. Oh gosh, Zach, why do people have to bring up the Rothschilds all the time? But beyond the Rothschild, Zach is bringing up, I think I'm a pretty pro-trade guy. I do tend to be, and I'm critical of my own tendency to be kind of fundamentalist and free trade. Like, yeah, and I love the WTO. I'm actually against the TPP because I think that was sort of, and the TTIP, the version with Europe, because I think that like sort of gets away from the broader base of the WTO. But I do think, I think there's definitely scope for looking a little more seriously. Like, I think it is accurate to say that we sacrificed, it may be accurate to say, I don't say it is, but it may be accurate to say that we sacrificed the US middle class in order to get some geopolitical bonuses from Mexico and China. I think that's possible. Once again, I don't have a lot of faith in economics, and B, am not a witch doctor economist, so I can't look into that. It's something I'd love to look into in some detail someday. If I had a spare 6 months somewhere, but I'm not. So yeah, I don't want to. I'm not saying that Trump. I definitely feel and think that Trump is 100% wrong on trade, but I don't want to say that I know that for sure because I'm not an expert on this. And I am very suspicious of economics as it's practiced now. But I am 100% sure that the way that Trump is doing this, the way that this is rolling out, will undermine the trade system that the United States essentially built for its benefit. So there's that. Question. Okay, Travis. That's it. Travis has pointed out that DoD does look at steel closely, as well as rare earth metals and others that are actually critical in that strategy. Yes, obviously, certain industrial materials are crucial to national security policy. I think, this is just floating through my head. I think Mattis, the defense secretary, James Mattis, actually came out against these tariffs before that reason, because this actually might hurt national security by making these inputs more expensive. The U.S. is the third biggest producer of steel. Most of China's steel goes to making Chinese products. Why not go after electronics if he wants to hurt China? That goes into the minutia that I just don't know about. With steel, it's actually kind of interesting. I was reading an analysis of the George W. Bush tariffs from 2002, 2003, and back then it was seen as a very straightforward political calculation. There were folks in West Virginia and I don't know, some other sort of Rust Belt state that were helped directly by those tariffs, and it's quite possible that I guess electronics industries are still based in Northern California, so Trump isn't going to go out of his way to help out Silicon Valley, which is what would happen with electronics. So yeah, this sort of basic, input, output, coal, steel, that's the sort of thing that provides a political benefit, like a direct political benefit in terms of actual executives of coal and steel companies that are right-leaning anyway. That's the kind of thing that provides a benefit for a Republican president. So yeah, so I don't think like detailed stuff. Okay, unless there's another direct question on trade, I think I'm going to move to Xi Jinping and his new role in China. Last chance for a direct question on trade. All right, not seeing it. Okay, so what we saw over the past week is the fruition of something that's been developing in China for quite some time. Xi Jinping is sort of the supreme guy in China right now. You got to be careful. The thing that actually happened last week was that the terms of the president of China were extended through some kind of administrative thing, and that, for some reason, that was the point at which the Western media decided to flip out about this. I think it's definitely right to be flipping out about this, but this is something that's been developing for a while. And in the Chinese system, the actual title isn't necessarily the most important thing. You had Deng Xiaoping, who was probably I mean, gosh, I mean, you want to talk about one of the most important and interesting figures in 20th century history. I think Deng Xiaoping is going to be remembered more and more and more. This is the guy who was the second sort of supreme leader guy in China. He never really had, or well, he did, but his roles in the Chinese government infrastructure never really reflected the amount of power that he had. He just sort of, if decisions got made, they got made at Deng's house, But this is significant. What is happening is significant. The more significant move was not this, change to the president. Okay, the president can have multiple terms now. What was more significant was a Congress, or I don't know the exact terminology, plenum or something, that the Communist Party had last fall, where Xi Jinping did not appoint a successor. So the way that things have worked in China since Deng Xiaoping is that a successor is sort of anointed for the last 5 years of the supreme leader's term. And this is something that I've always admired a lot about China, and I thought it was really impressive. To be clear, I think that China is a tin pot dictatorship, not tin pot dictator. It's a very involved, very repressive, very intimidating dictatorship. It is a country to be taken seriously. It is not a country to be admired. But there was this aspect of China that has always been kind of fascinating. I think that I don't think that China is going to, under its current system, is going to prove to be a good innovation country, but it has been a fantastic catch-up country. And the sort of weird managerial setup that the Chinese leadership has had since Deng has made all the difference. And I think it has been an aspect that has been kind of impressive. So what happened with Mao, the founding ruler of China, was China got burned. China got burned really hard. And even to the point where people in the Chinese leadership acknowledged this, not loudly, but they sort of looked and said, okay, Mao was great when he was fighting, to take over the country. He was great for the first 10, 15 years or so running the country. And then he got really old, and like his mistress started running stuff. And like he just went crazy and, came up with things like the Great Leap Forward that killed 30 million people, and the Cultural Revolution, which kind of ripped to shreds a lot of the progress that China had made to that point. So after Mao had died, the Chinese leadership sort of collectively realized that this sort of personality cult leader was not necessarily a good thing. So since then, with Deng Xiaoping, who's the guy, one of the reasons I'm so impressed with Deng Xiaoping is he's the guy who opened up the Chinese economy. He's the guy who sort of set everything in motion. And he also set in motion a system wherein the Chinese leadership changed every 10 years. You had Jiang, I'm sure I'm massacring all of these Chinese pronunciations, and I apologize, but you had, for 10 years, you had, like sort of 92 to 2002, more or less, you had Jiang Zemin, sorry, from 2002 to 2012 or so, you had Hu Jintao, and now, supposedly from 2012 to 2022, you've got Xi Jinping, but now it's clear that that is breaking down, and this is sad. This is sad to see, because I think it's a sign of incredible weakness from China and incredible instability. I think a lot of the commentary in the Western media is buying this sort of is buying Xi Jinping's justification for taking all this power. It's like, oh, it's a really fraught and dangerous and difficult time for China. So it's necessary that Xi Jinping take all this power and just stay in power for 10, 20, 30 years to make sure everyth's okay. And what's kind of crazy is like reading newspapers in the US or Europe that buy that. This is a tremendous fall down for China from a sort of managerial elite that wasn't all about personality. And frankly, did an incredible freaking job to dumbass personality cult single dictator for life. The change in the one leader at the top, I don't want to go too far with this, does not mean that the entire Chinese system has changed irrevocably, but it is a very, very bad sign. And it's very disappointing, because honestly, I thought better of China than as another tin pot strongman dictatorship. I think there's a lot of stuff in media that goes way too far in comparing what Xi Jinping is now to Putin in Russia or Erdogan in Turkey. I think that's unfair. I think China remains a much more serious, much more impressive place than either of those, not just in terms of GDP, but in terms of just sort of capacity for everything. But you can see why those comparisons are made, and it's hard to see why China did this, other than the sort of vanity of one man and fear and inadequacy on the part of the rest of the governing elite. It's very sad to see, and I think it makes the country much less stable. Questions on China and Xi Jinping. I actually don't have a ton to say about this. Zach Osborne says, I have a friend who lives in Beijing. He seems to think part of it is self-preservation. Apparently, the president has had to deal with a lot of attempts on his life, and there's a lot of rival families. See, that's really sad to read that. And I think the answer to the vulnerabilities that are posed by assassination and intrigue of that nature is not to concentrate more power in one man. If a particular figure is afraid of assassination, giving that figure more power is not going to make your system more stable. And I think it's those kinds of basic critiques that certainly aren't being made much in China, though there are a few courageous people doing that, but aren't being made in the Western press either. I think that a lot of people have just, the two people writing about China at every outlet versus the 200 writing about Trump, anti-Trump or pro-Trump, writing about the Trump show, haven't really, I don't know, I don't think they're really internalized, or they're just not expressing some of these basic critiques. It's a sad thing. It's a sad thing to see. Any other questions on China? Rashid, was China's Rashid Betha, apologies for the pronunciation, was China's recent leadership move a calculation that the West will continue to experience political issues that will limit its ability to quickly respond to new challenges? This is an interesting, are you sort of aiming at the sort of China stepping into the vacuum that Donald Trump has created? Is that, or were you talking about they are having difficulty, they're doing this now because the West can't respond to it? I think that this Xi Jinping thing has a lot more to do with internal tensions than it does with external ones. I think it's just sort of fear and inadequacy at the top in China, and he was able to really. He did a brilliant job. You don't get to run a country of 1.4 billion people as a sole leader. You don't get to beat out an entire oligarchy without being pretty good at what you're doing. The way that he used the corruption trials, some of which may have been authentic, but he used those corruption trials to sort of cut out all the other, cut out the legs from under all the other factions. Was pretty impressive. But as far as recent leadership move, a calculation that the West will continue to experience political issues. Well, if that's a calculation, I don't think they're making that's not a careful calculation. I think it's pretty obvious to China at this point that the West is incapable of real leadership or going in any coherent direction, and probably will be for some time. And Zach Osborne mentions Xi just did a big anti-corruption purge. He's been cleaning house, and in two senses. He's been helping with corruption, but also likely to be, but also using that as a weapon against others. All right. Any other questions? Okay. How is Xi getting? Okay. So Marlon Brian Munoz Nunez asks, how is Xi getting away with this? It seems that there was some institutional resistance for exactly the situation. Have the communist leadership weakened? Yes, I think this is actually it's a broader issue that I think I need to do a video on occasionally. There's this sort of assumption that the gamble that the United States and Europe made, if this is really what it was, of sort of like sacrificing their working classes to bringing China into the national, into the world economic system. There's been a lot of people saying recently, actually using this as an excuse that this gamble was somehow wrong or somehow a mistake. And I think that's actually bullshit. I think that is an incorrect read of what has been happening in China. And I absolutely do believe that the Communist Party's power has been, I won't say that their power has been shaken, but the way in which they exert their power has been changed dramatically. And it has, if you look at some of the coverage out of China, Xi Jinping does see himself as reacting to a terribly, terribly difficult time, which is kind of crazy if you consider, well, compare where China is now with a massive middle class and more and more influence everywhere in the world. Like, this is a bad time for China compared to any point between, compared to any point between 1800 and 2010, this is a bad time for China. This is an amazing time for China. What this is this is a bad time for the Chinese Communist Party. They have managed to, the Great Wall of China with the Great Firewall of China, with the blocking of the internet, advanced repression. Repression is going up in China, which is never a sign of a secure and happy regime. So what is happening is, with this birth of the middle class, there is exactly what political scientists of the mid-20th century said is happening. Democracy is aborting in China. There are middle classes that are agitating and making new requirements from the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. Yes, like, China is becoming more shaky. There's a lot of sort of, I would say, impatient analysis right now. The Economist does this a lot. They're like, and actually there was this, I wish I could find it because it would be the centerpiece of the video I'll eventually do on this, but there was some ridiculous sentence in The Economist that was like, certain Chinese cities now have a GDP per capita that's higher than South Korea's was when it went democratic. Why isn't China democratic yet? And the key ridiculous part of that statement is that certain Chinese cities, you have this this immense middle class that's still only about a third of the country, and this immense middle class, if it were broader and incorporated, more of the population of China, would be very interested in a more traditionally bourgeois, liberal government. But they're mostly concerned about defending what they have against the 600 million Chinese that want what they have. So yeah, they're still very invested in a repressive country. And I think it is ridiculous for people to look at a civilization state like China of 1.4 billion people and expect it to operate on the same timeline or with the same metrics of the 30 million people in South Korea, or the 5 to 10 million people, I'm sorry, Taiwan, or the tiny Hong Kong or Singapore. It's absurd. So I do think, it's a very long way of saying, I think that the Western claims that, did I just lose the internet there? We'll keep talking. I think that the Western claims that our outreach to China has failed, or China's not becoming more democratic, are ridiculous. I think that the Chinese Communist Party is in a terrible, terrible place and are like tremendously threatened. And that, I think, is why Xi Jinping was able to take all this power, because he's not competing against, well, he is to a degree, because the Communist Party is now incorporating more capitalist, more bourgeois types, but he's not competing in a political sphere with the Chinese public at this point. He's got repressive stuff to use against them. He's competing within the sphere of the people who've been benefiting from the Chinese Communist Party forever. So yes, the Chinese Communist Party is shaky. That's what this is a sign of. the fact that everyone in the Chinese Communist Party is terrified enough to be like, yeah, okay, let's go with a strong man. Let's go back with one guy in charge. He'll tell us what to do. He'll tell us who to kill. He'll tell us how to handle everything, because they're terrified. That, I think, is the real sort of thing behind Xi Jinping. And it's actually something to be optimistic about. Well, I don't know about optimistic about, because when, and it's not if, when China transitions to another system of government, it's going to be incredibly dislocating for everybody in the world. And it's also what they produce next. I mean, if you think China is scary, I did a video on this, it was sort of why the Chinese Communist Party is the United States government's best friend or something like that. Like, it's like, if you think China is scary under a kleptocratic, ideologically confused 20th century one-party government, China can get real scary under sort of like a neoliberal sort of entrepreneurial, sort of a neoliberal state that, and I consider neoliberal a compliment, by the way, is under sort of a neoliberal state that truly unleashed the Chinese entrepreneurial urge. I mean, if you want scary, I mean, that is the sort of the great event of the early 21st century. So anyway, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, their influence in Vancouver is growing. That's another sign. That's another sign of just how screwed up China is the fact that, all the people who do win in the Chinese system still want to get the hell out. So they're buying up. They're having a serious impact on both West Coast U.S. and Canadian real estate. These sort of in the U.S., we make it very welcoming for folks who have money. So I think I think the cost of the U.S. citizenship, or at least a green card, is about $500,000. If you've got $500,000, it may be higher now, or $500,000 plus, you can buy your way to live in the United States, and more of that is happening. Jack Ma, the sort of famous head of, I believe, Alibaba, sort of one of the Chinese tech giants, bought like a quarter of New York State, to live in. Okay, it's not that much, but he bought like thousands and thousands of acres of New York, of upstate New York, as an escape hatch. So that's another sign of sort of how fraught and how not so strong and intimidating China is. Any last China questions? Okay, Hassan M. Robert Morris, the airline industry, like Boeing and auto market, will not be able to sell into Chinese market in the future. They're getting better. It will be self-sustained and more specialized. See, that's an interesting argument. I've been looking a lot at trade lately and sort of free trade regimes and whatnot, and it has been fascinating the way that China has been sort of stepping in and trying to take leadership on like sort of the institutions of globalization. Because if the Chinese market gets super involved and super great at everything, they're going to be incredibly interested in selling their stuff to everybody. And that will create great openings. I do believe still that free trade regimes are great for everybody, but they are always best for whoever is biggest. And China will be biggest. So the idea that China is going to get protectionist is kind of hard for me to credit. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think they're going to all of a sudden. I think definitely 50 to 100 years from now, that most Chinese cars will be, most cars in China, or maybe a small majority of the cars in China will be produced by Chinese manufacturers, but the market will be so large. Okay, also cars 50 years from now, hard to really talk about. But any kind of goods, the Chinese will be producing most of it, just as in the United States today, the Chinese are producing most of it. But in the U.S. today, the U.S. is producing most of the stuff in the U.S. economy, but still the money we take in, is the bread and butter of Japan, Germany, and a whole bunch of other places. So that China, I do not this is a very confused and long way of saying I do not think China will get more protectionist. Chinese goods getting better, I think, will be better for the world in general, and they will not abandon a free trade regime. They'll be perfectly happy to have U.S. brands occupy as slices in their market because they know it's good for them and allows them to sell everything else to everyone else. Russia, they're setting up Africa to be its consumer base for the next 50 years. The whole topic of China and Africa is something that would expand this out to years. Any last questions about China? How about China and Africa? I haven't kept track. China is approaching Africa on a trade basis, is building roads, is doing this, that, and the other thing. And the United States is responding by creating weird military fiefs and relationships with defense departments. That kind of makes China the good guys and us the bad guys. I need to look a lot more deeply into what's happening in Africa. Africa is 54 countries. I have actually talked very briefly about my impressions from visiting some countries in Africa in a video a while ago. I think Why China Will Never Rule the World, which I still believe in. I think it's still a very good video. China will never rule the world, but it will be the biggest economy. That's almost irreversible. But the competition between the United States and China is utterly pointless and will be more and more important over the next couple decades. That's after the Middle East. Well, if the disaster in the Middle East ever ends, we'll begin to see more focus on the U.S.-China competition in Africa, which is once again utterly pointless and will create a lot more death and destruction than was necessary. How do you see, Hassan M., how do you see the benefits of state capitalism? Yeah, my view on China is that state capitalism, the sort of extreme approach that they have taken, and also in the context, and this might seem a little, I don't want this to seem racist, but in the context of a culture with a history of a sort of top-down hierarchy, the way that China always has had. So, this sort of directed state capitalism that might work in a country like Japan or China may not necessarily work certainly wouldn't work in the United States or European countries or, really the rest of the world. So that's a real limitation of the Chinese model. But the way that I see China is that an authoritarian state capitalism model can be very good for catching up. And I think that's what China is still in the process of doing. In certain aspects, it may look like they've caught up completely. Their high-speed rail is better than ours, this, that, and the other thing. But keep in mind, there's still 300 to, 800 million people who are dirt farming in China. So they haven't really caught up all the way. It's the innovation on top of that. It's sort of building the future beyond that I don't see them having much potential in, frankly. You can see through state capitalist stuffs like the Russians, the Soviets were the first folks to get they were the first to get a man in orbit, I believe, or at least they were the first to launch a satellite. State capitalism can be good for stuff like that, which you have, I think, China. I don't believe that China's leading in AI at this point, but I think they're definitely leading in quantum communication or something like that. That's the kind of thing that a state capitalist sort of state capitalist system can be good for. But as far as just like developing the culture around consumption, that's still always been the United States or a more free market economy. It's hard to see that kind of innovation, that kind of just weird stuff like, some bicycle guys, you can't have this anymore, but some bicycle mechanics in Ohio figure out how to fly planes. But you can have some guys in Arizona figure out that a certain model of burrito shop does really well. And that stuff is a lot more important than we typically recognize. So like the state capitalist top down, they're good at, can still, not good, but can still have the capacity to launch someone to the moon first or figure out quantum satellites or that kind of the other thing. But as far as the actually building the future, actually building a broad economy, I do not believe that state capitalists are good at that. They're good at catch up. They're good at infrastructure. They're good at that kind of thing. That's my current approach on state capitalism. Okay, is now a good time to invest in China for Western middle class? Man, I have a bit though. I think yes. My recommendation, as I bought on the dip today, would be emerging market ETFs more generally that have exposure to China. But as far as like, I did buy a few shares of Alibaba stock recently. Yeah, I don't know. I can't necessarily recommend that because, as I said, yeah, emerging markets are the future. I do believe that China has. When I buy something to hold for decades. And I do think China has a rather large crisis coming in the next couple decades. But if you're buying on a like 1 to 5 year horizon, yeah, sure, of course, invest in China. But that's not the kind of investing I do. Anyway, okay, we are done with trade. We are done with China. Let's talk about the Saudi nuclear thing, which I go back and forth on this as to far as how panicked I am. It is not great. So the Saudis have put out a proposal for, I think, $80 billion worth of nuclear power plants. That is what they want to build. They are. It's hard to see why. Saudi Arabia has energy. Though I suppose it does if we were looking at just a country in the place where Saudi Arabia is with its resource demands. I think like there is a big call for desalination, turning salt water into fresh water. And if you attach the nuclear plant to that, that makes a lot of sense. So as suspicious as I am of the idea of giving Saudi Arabia nuclear technology, there is a rationale there. So what they've got now is, I don't know if it's quite as simple as just an RFP, like a request for proposals, but they have announced that this is something that they are doing, and they are going to select a winner before too long. I find this just that at that level, I find that pretty terrifying. I think that is the sort of thing we should definitely try to stop, as we tried to stop it in Iran, and I think did effectively stop it to a degree. Saudi Arabia has now been arguing, well, you should give us what Iran did. Iran can enrich uranium, this, that, and the thing. It's like, yeah, Iran can enrich uranium in the context of massive inspections, being an international pariah, nobody wanting to do business with you. So that gets to a point that I made in a video a couple things back, so why Saudi Arabia is worse than Iran. Like, I am perfectly fine with treating Iran like Saudi Arabia. I think that's appropriate, or rather treating Saudi Arabia closer to the way we treat Iran. So we treat Iran like shit, and we treat Saudi Arabia like our best friend ever. So yeah, just sort of treating Iran not quite as poorly, and treating Saudi Arabia much, much more poorly. That seems about right to me. But this idea that because one aspect of the Iran nuclear deal seems slightly more advantageous than what we're offering Saudi Arabia here means that that's insane. That is utter insanity. Yes, I'm perfectly open to treating Saudi Arabia the way we treat Iran, but not in this one negotiating point. Okay, so the United States would obviously love this. We're in a point now where Japan and Germany, actually, did Japan back up a bit? But certainly Germany and I think Japan as well, have now completely gotten out, or trying to completely get out of the nuclear industry. They are not interested in building new plants. In the United States, I think we are finally building like 1 or 2 more plants, but that's after a break since the 1970s. So obviously nuclear industries in Russia, China, and, well, not so much China, but certainly in Russia and the United States, France, South Korea, are desperate for more business. So this is very attractive. This $80 billion to build nuclear plants is tremendously attractive to businesses in the United States. And I suppose my message, not just to the United States, but to everyone, is just resist that temptation. Resist that temptation, because Saudi Arabia is not a strong, stable place. It is not Sorry, we got some sirens outside. Saudi Arabia is, as I've documented many times, and longtime viewers will be well aware, is not a place whose long-time viability I have any real faith in. So I mean, this $80 billion, like where is this $80 billion going to come from? The Aramco IPO, which I should probably do a video on, is unlikely to yield anywhere near as much money as is supposedly promised. Saudi reserves. There was some headlines like, "Wow, Saudi reserves started growing again in October, November, and December," and they did by like $1 to $2 billion. Do you guys remember what also happened last fall? Yeah, they arrested all the richest people in the country and started taking their money. So if Saudi foreign reserves only went up by $1 billion or $2, that's a real problem. And I think Saudi reserves are likely to continue falling, especially in the context of this past February in U.S. markets, because a lot of Saudi investment is placed in U.S. securities. So Saudi Arabia is not a secure place. That $80 billion are not necessarily going to come. There are aspects of its sort of authoritarian approach that are very friendly to the nuclear business because they can make guarantees that others can't. But they can make these guarantees. Whether these guarantees actually come to fruition is incredibly suspect. And giving nuclear technology, nuclear enrichment capacity to Saudi Arabia right now is insane. It's just insane. Russia shouldn't do it. China shouldn't do it. We certainly shouldn't do it. And what's going on now with this weird, corrupt, creepy, freaking Trump, Kushner, Saudi king axis is we're talking about actually giving them a better deal on nuclear technology and with more ability to do things like enrich uranium than we have given to pretty much anybody else. The UAE, another state that probably shouldn't have a nuclear plant, was given one, or rather they bought one from U.S. companies under Obama. And that was, I think, a mistake. But the absolute basement that we should be considering with Saudi Arabia, as far as selling them a nuclear plant, is the agreement that Obama did with the UAE. I think it's called the 123 agreement. It sets very strong limits or whatnot. And that's what was offered by Obama, by the Obama administration, when Saudi Arabia started talking about this a year or so ago, a couple of years back. So what Trump and Kushner may end up doing is going Trump and Kushner, and through the Department of Energy, so that's our old friend Rick Perry, is the head of the Department of Energy, fresh off his attempt to get the U.S. government to subsidize coal companies across the country. Now his next brainwave is to give Saudi Arabia a better deal that allows them to do more things with nuclear technology. I think that is freaking crazy. I think we should offer the same agreement. Well, I don't think we should offer the same agreement we gave to UAE, but if we need to be in this business, that's what we should offer. And if the Russians and the Chinese get it instead, well, you know what? That's just fine. Let that be on their heads. People do not take nuclear proliferation anywhere near as seriously as they should. I think probably if we had a decent relationship with Russia, again, probably neither of us would be offering technology to Saudi Arabia, this nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. That's the way things used to be. If anybody in the U.S. was concerned about nuclear non-proliferation, we would have a much better relationship with Russia than we do now. I think that the whole Ukraine mess kind of destroyed the sort of nuclear non-proliferation regime. People don't take this stuff seriously enough. Our approach to India is another example. There should have been real consequences for both India and Pakistan for for developing nuclear weapons, and there were not, because we sort of said, oh, well, geopolitically makes sense to have these folks on our side, or this, that, and the other thing. So yeah, I do not think the Saudi Arabians should have nukes. Sorry, I do not think the Saudi Arabians should be developing nuclear power at this point, because it gives their potential successor state, which is quite possibly a lot more religiously extreme and unstable than the current monarchy, should not have spare nuclear fuel lying around to be used for those sorts of purposes. I mean, it's quite possible to envision a sort of nightmare scenario where the Saudis make this a priority, developing a bomb a priority, and they're already allies with Pakistan. They could probably do it in about 6 weeks. Manage to attain a real functioning nuclear bomb about 6 months before they fall, and gives this capability to whatever caliphate follows. It's just the height of irresponsibility to be involved in this at all. So yeah, that's what I have to say about Saudi nuclear technology. Does anybody have any other questions? I think we've pretty much done what I wanted to do today. We're almost at an hour. I can go longer if we've got questions. Loga Cool Extreme asks, is Saudi Arabia competent enough to make nuclear weapons? Besides, Pakistan and Saudis have a nuclear sharing program. They could get it from Pakistan or China. I think that question answers itself. No, I don't think that there are Saudi princes, who've really put together the necessary nuclear technology knowledge. They can buy it. The Saudis still have a lot of money that they can waste on stuff. So yeah, they can buy it from Pakistan. They can buy it from North Korea. Don't know what Quigley's dilemma is that Rashad Betha keeps talking about. But yes, India does have nukes. That is true. Do we have any questions on the topic of Saudi Arabia and nuclear technology? Thomas Lowell Roost asks, what will happen when the Saudi oil supplies run out? The Saudi oil supplies are not going to run out. That's the thing. That's what they're facing right now, and what the oil markets are facing is the fact, fact overstates it a bit, but the strong suspicion that I find quite likely that a lot of Saudi Arabia's oil reserves are never going to come out of the ground, or are going to come out of the ground over the course of centuries. Saudi Arabia will continue to produce oil long after Canada has given up, long after the fracking fields of Texas and North or South Dakota have fallen, because Saudi Arabia can get oil out much more cheaply, and they have essentially limitless reserves. And if they started using any of the technology that's used in Canada and the United States, they'd find infinitely more. So Saudi oil is not going to run out. What is going to run out, if the demand for Saudi oil runs out, this is some econ one-on-one I believe in, with a lot of political stuff thrown on top of it, the price is going to collapse. The extraction price for Saudi Arabia, which means that they'll keep producing forever, is like, it's still viable. You can still make a profit on it at like $8 to $12. So Saudi oil is viable forever. But the break-even price for the Saudi government and all the money that they have to spend that stuff on is much higher. So we're not talking about the viability of taking oil out of the ground in Saudi Arabia. That will continue as long as there's still an oil industry, for plastic bottles, for this, that, and the other thing. We're talking about the viability of the Saudi state as it currently exists. And I believe that's got, I mean, honestly, I made a video called Saudi Arabia is Finished about a year, closing in on a year ago. The Saudi system has already changed irretrievably. It was sort of a consensus-based family business this time a year ago. Now it's a autocrat under one guy who's likely to live for decades. So Saudi Arabia, as we knew it, actually it's already gone. But I think there's going to be much larger crises and much larger changes within the next 10 years. Yes, so there's that. Logo Cool Extreme. Iran has nukes, potential for nukes. Doesn't the Saudi family have a right to defend itself? No, they do not. I think that we have gone to a great deal of effort to make certain that Iran does not have nukes, and we don't. The Iran nuclear deal only has, is going to need to be renegotiated, I think, in another 10 years. And that made sense in the context of somebody who was going to actually build on the nuclear deal and build some more peace and understanding between Iran, so we didn't have this terrible situation we've had. That's not what's happening for these 4 years, unfortunately. But the idea that things are going to somehow be improved by Saudi Arabia getting nukes is just insane. No, they don't. They don't have. Honestly, Iran is a much safer and more stable country that should not have nukes. That should be our approach and our continuing approach, and it is our continuing approach. This idea that Saudi, that's exactly what they're arguing right now. It's like, oh yeah, don't we have a right to defend ourselves? No. And when have the Saudis ever been any good at defending themselves? That's not what the Saudis do. The Saudis give us money and we defend them. No, I reject that wholeheartedly. Sorry, I should. Maybe I haven't done a very good job of it. Once the U.S. decides to hold back in the Middle East, in that case, why shouldn't the GCC have a NATO-type defense pact with without nukes? Because the GCC is a joke. The GCC is not something I take very seriously. Okay, that seemed a little harsh. The GCC is an interesting group of countries. Actually, Oman, I think, has some independent viability. But these countries exist to keep oil wealth from real countries. The reason that the Brits and the US established these dumbass oil monarchies, these places, these throwbacks to the 1600s, the reason they're established was to keep Arab nationalists from benefiting from oil reserves. That's why the GCC exists. I don't think the GCC has much viability outside of the context of U.S. support. I guess they can just switch. Switch over to China from the U.S. possibly. I think that's something they'd be interested in. But yeah, the GCC is not something I'm a big fan of. Nor do I think that they. I mean, it's just such a like this idea that we should be invested in a bunch of medieval king petrostates having long-term viability and power is silly and also pretty unlikely in terms of where petroleum markets are going. Okay. Questions. Is there any hope for a change in the American policy regarding the war in Yemen? Yes, there's hope. There's hope, but there's not enough. We are pressuring. I think that U.S. pressure did have something to do with not the lifting, but the lessening of the severity of the Saudi blockade in Yemen. I don't mean that it's at all good right now. It's just better than when they completely shut down all humanitarian traffic inside and outside of the country a couple months back. But more people are becoming aware of it, but not enough. It's just not a focus. I think there are Congress people and senators who are trying desperately to make it clear to the U.S. people what's going on there. Chris Murphy from Connecticut, Ro Khanna, sort of Silicon Valley's representative from California. I mean, these folks are trying to do the work. The problem is there's so little investment and energy put towards foreign policy at this point because everybody's just flipping out. Even Democrats, those few Democrats who are more traditionally peace-oriented, in which I would include Chris Murphy. Well, actually, no. Chris Murphy went to Ukraine with McCain, but who can be occasionally those Democrats can be occasionally relied upon to do something peace-focused. Can't get a word in edgewise. We've actually now got this sort of broader more peace-oriented public in the United States that was super angry about Iraq, they're all like champing at the bit for war with Russia right now. I think the insanity of the Trump show has sucked all the oxygen out of any public concern about foreign policy in the U.S., which is a real tragedy. So I think the Trump show is the main bar towards looking at what we're doing in Yemen. I think under Bush or Obama or any competently run president, the Yemen story would have a bigger impact by now and would have had some changes, but it's just not happening. Logo Cool Extreme, is the war in Yemen legal? Does it have congressional approval? No, it definitely doesn't have congressional approval. What both the Obama and the Trump, just briefly for those who may be listening who are not aware, Yemen is seen by the UN as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. We've got cholera, we've got starvation, and we've got 10. The estimate of the amount of civilians killed has been around 10,000. I feel like for 2 years now. It's got to be higher than that now. But we just don't have the data. We have very little. It's like Syria, but like 5 decades back in terms of development. So we don't have any citizen journalism or to really establish what's going on in Yemen, or we only have very limited citizen journalism to establish what's going on in Yemen, because Yemen is just so much poorer than Syria. And what's been happening is Saudi Arabia has been bombing the shit out of it, because they really don't like the Houthi regime that basically managed to take over the entire country before 2015. And the Saudis have been bombing and not making much progress and not making much progress. And now even the little bit of Yemen that they have taken has overthrown the official president that the Saudis are nominally fighting for. So the Saudis have basically been brutalizing and destroying Yemen, and the United States has been supporting them completely. We have been providing aerial refueling. We have been providing intelligence. So it's not just Saudi Arabia that is killing one of the poorest countries in the world. It is the United States and Saudi Arabia that's killing one of the poorest people in the world. And is the war in Yemen legal? To return to the question, the war in Yemen is the war in Yemen legal? The justification that Obama and Trump have been using is the authorization for the use of military force, which I think was enacted back in 2001. And that's their story, which is risible horseshit. They're actually fighting the Houthis, who are fighting Al-Qaeda. The AUMF back in 2001 was put together to authorize us to go after the people who did 9/11. Al-Qaeda are the people who did 9/11. Well, I don't know. The real viability of Al-Qaeda as a international institution is something I have some opinions about. But anyway, at least for the legal purposes of the AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force, the U.S. Legislation from 2001, we're supposed to be going after Al-Qaeda. In Yemen, we are going against Al-Qaeda's enemies. No, I don't believe the war in Yemen is legal. This is something we should talk about more. I should do another Yemen video. Anyway. All right, Logo Cool Extreme asks, if the U.S. pulls out, won't the Saudis still, presumably you're talking about, won't the Saudis still bomb them? Yes, but they'll have much less capacity. The Saudi military force is a joke. With U.S. support, they have failed miserably to take back much at all of Yemen. And without U.S. support, and it's not just U.S. support, it's also NATO support. There's also British and French participation in this as well that gets almost no press, but obviously much smaller than our own. No, the Saudis, it's actually quite possible that the Saudis bombing would get more brutal because they wouldn't have any kind of U.S. intelligence support, but also without a refueling, they're going to be able to do a lot less. And I think that the world would look at it a lot more seriously if it didn't have U.S. cover. So. Do we have other questions? They spend $80 billion. How do you spend that much money and be bad? Okay, do we have any? Oh, someone was talking about Cold War 2.0, which is good because I did want to talk about Russia. Where were we again? What is the likely endgame of the so-called Cold War 2.0 between Russia and the West? Persian Immortal asks, what is the likely endgame of the so-called Cold War 2.0 between Russia and the West? The Cold War 2.0 between Russia and the West is a marketing campaign for the Russian and U.S. Military industrial complexes. There is nothing there. There was a story that I should have done a video about, but I tweeted a lot about from early February. Some Syrian government folks attacked a position around Deir ez-Zor, I think, that was held by the SDF and U.S. folks. The U.S. folks reacted very, very strongly, just massacred people, just killed them left and right, just blew them all out of the water. What was revealed in the weeks following, it's been slowly leaking out, is that those folks weren't just Syrian government folks. Those folks were Russians. Those folks were Russian citizens, Russian folks with Russian military experience. The reaction to that is fascinating because both the United States and Russia did everything they possibly could to hide that this had happened. Because if you talk about what actually happened there, the true dynamics of Russia and the U.S. in Syria are revealed. We're talking about, the big story now is that, oh, it's this new Cold War and it's this new proxy war in Syria. And oh gosh, the U.S. has a lot to be afraid of from Russia. It's a joke. It's a sort of participation trophy that we're awarding the Russians. You know, if there's no real conflict there, the U.S. is still dominant, like hyper dominant in that military arena. The Russians have been weaseling about this. They're like, oh no, and it's true. They were not technically Russian military. What they were is they were Russian military contractors. They were obviously acting with the endorsement and support of the Russian government, the Syrian government, certain Russian billionaires, but they're deniable because they're contractors rather than soldiers, which is it's also kind of interesting. You guys may remember back in 2004 when in Iraq, the U.S. government went and destroyed Fallujah, just like went in, and I mean there were like 4 or 5 battles of Fallujah. This was one of the earlier ones. What launched that was the death of 4 U.S. military contractors. So I think, granted, we're much less relatively powerful than we were back in 2004, but I think that's a good measure of like where the U.S. and Russia are versus each other in terms of competition. The U.S., if 4 military contractors are killed, we take over, reconquest, destroy, perhaps that's an unfair characterization, a city of Fallujah. I mean, we just, at the cost of thousands of lives. If Russia has hundreds of military, and the estimates, even the most pro-Russia sources, like South Front, have talked about dozens. Newsweek, which is actually not very trustworthy anymore, but also I think the New York Times reported hundreds of Russian military contractors were killed. Hundreds were killed, and the Russian government's response is to hide it, is to run away from it, to deny it. So this isn't really a real competition. I don't think that there's a Cold War 2.0 going on here. It's interesting because I was actually thinking about my own response, because a number of years back, I flipped out when Turkey shot down a Russian plane. To me, that was horrifying. To me, that was that brought up the specter of 2 great powers fighting each other. By great power, I mean, like, I think it's like the top 40 economies in the world. That hasn't happened. Like, no one in the top 40 economies in the world has fought a war against anybody else in 70 years. Wars like that involve, Syria is terrible. It is horrible. I've made a lot of videos on how terrible and horrible it is, but it's killed 500,000 people in 8 years now. Like a war between great powers kills 500,000 people in a week. So I was terrified at the prospect of Turkey and Russia getting into something. And it's interesting looking, I was like, wait a second. So why do I look at the United States actually killing hundreds of Russian soldiers, sorry, contractors, and I don't flip out seriously. And that's because these folks are in such different classes. Someone had pointed out, I think it's a great article, and I don't often say this about the National Review, but by David French in the National Review talking about this issue. He's like, we should pay more attention to this. We absolutely should. And this is an incontrovertible point that he brought up. The United States killed more Russian soldiers in February of this past year than they did in all of the Cold War. Why am I not flipping out about that? I am not flipping out about that because this episode kind of reveals that Russia is not, it's a paper tiger. Russia versus Turkey, that's a real war that could start. That's a real war that could happen and is terrifying and would involve, the destruction of populations and cities and this, that, and the other thing. Russia and the US is not a war that can happen because the people in Russia, Putin, folks there know that the result is eradication. They do still have a nuclear, capability. That's very true, very real. But they don't want to end the world to get in a fight with the United States. There's no real conventional threat that Russia poses beyond that very real threat of nuclear annihilation. That is a cord that nobody's going to pull unless one of Trump's successors is dumb enough to invade Russia. I don't see that happening. But so yeah, I just don't. The Cold War 2.0 is not something I really believe in. Questions. Questions. I think we are closing in on wrapping up. Thank you for that question about Cold War 2.0 because I did want to talk about the Russia-Syria thing. What about Bangladesh, India slave workers that live in the Gulf states? Do they have any power? That's a very interesting question from Thomas Lul-Roost. I think the Gulf states very intentionally don't allow those people to put down roots. They're consciously kept in labor camps. I think I don't know if, well, actually, certainly no in Saudi Arabia. I don't know the extent to which in the other Gulf states, but they're segregated by sex for sure. The idea is for these people envisioned by the countries is you make a lot of money and go home. And that's easier to maintain in fucked up authoritarian countries like the GCC countries. You can't do that I wouldn't want people to do that in the US or Germany or something like that. Germany famously had a guest worker program and was unwilling to acknowledge that Turkish people have been living there for 25 years up until like 2000 or so. And they eventually had to realize that a lot of those Turks weren't going home because they were more German than Turkish at that point. Don't tell any German Turks I said that. But I think because the GCC, those countries are all sort of messed up monarchies, they are better able to keep the Bangladeshi Indian type slave workers. That's a very fair characterization, I think, from taking over. But that is fascinating because you look at some of these population figures, and I think it's the UAE in particular. It's like there are under 100. I don't know what it is for all the Emirates together, but it's not much more than 100,000 actual Emiratis there, on top of millions of slave workers. It's if those folks just sort of decide, wait a second, why isn't this our country now? I don't see that as tremendously likely, but it's certainly a consideration, which is also another element in just their lack of viability as countries and places that we should talk about with rights to defend themselves. I mean, they're colonies. They're colonies of the U.S. and Britain. Anyway, why is Russia falling so bad? From Lagacool Extreme. That is a great question. Why is Russia failing so bad? Well, it's the question is what on what metric is Russia supposedly failing? I would say that Russia is a freer, better place. I mean, I know I have viewers who would hate me for this, but I'd say Russia is probably still, even under Putin, a freer, better place than it was under communism. Why is Russian foreign policy failing so bad? I think because there is such high expectations for Russia. You know, Russia is powerful. Russia is scary. Russia is, that even goes back before the Cold War. I mean, Russia was the grand, at least in the English-speaking culture, Russia was the grand boogeyman for the British Empire for 100 years before they became British allies in World War I and World War II. So for centuries, Russia has been this scary specter haunting Europe and the world, and they're just not that right now. So I think that's got something to do with the sort of misperception of Putin's genius and this, that, and the other thing. I made a video called "Is Russia Winning?" that I think is pretty instructive on this. There's all these places where they're, from the Baltics to Syria to some other place, where their build is these folks who are, to Ukraine, these masterminds who are making everything happen, and you actually look at the details, and it's like, so they successfully got U.S. troops into the Baltics? It's not so successful. So yeah, they are failing. I think that's a really good question. And also Russia's big problem is the fact that it's a petrostate. It's really bad to have that much sort of petroleum power. And I actually often, I do wonder, it's like, how did the U.S. manage to avoid the trap of the petroleum state? Because the United States is a petroleum state. We are the largest, producer, I think, now. Yeah, we're the largest exporter, I think, of oil, not exporter, but I think we are the largest producer of oil in the world now. And we seem to have avoided this sort of petroleum curse. And I think that might have something to do with federalism. You know, I think it might have something to do with the fact that it's the Texas, the state of Texas at one point was sort of taken over and controlled by oil barons, but maybe the whole country was never really captured so much. Anyway, I don't know. We'll see. No, because John Rockefeller, whatever, the Rockefellers certainly had immense power around the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries. But yeah, I don't know. The petroleum curse is real. The idea that if you have a petroleum industry that pumps all this money into your economy, there's less incentive to do anything else. And I think Russia is better than that in a lot of ways, but isn't in a lot of other ways. Okay. I think I've covered everything that I intended to cover. Has anybody got some questions, some final questions before we close? Any thoughts on Russian transition of power in a post-Putin era from Shamik? Shamik? I'm scared. Yeah, I don't know. I think we may have gotten past the point where power in Russia can change through elections. I don't know. I could be wrong about that. I have not spent a ton of time looking into Russian internal politics behind the really surface New York Times stuff. I haven't read any books, so I can't speak to that. But my great fear with Russia has been, and one of the great problems, and this is kind of internal, is that we've got so many people, especially now, in Washington, D.C., who are focused on sticking it to Russia, sticking it to Russia, sticking it to Russia, because there's this perception that Russia is winning or beating us or something like that. My fear is that we go so whole hog in confronting Russia that we actually force a collapse in Russia, which I think is very possible, because I know a lot of Putin's internal power and legitimacy is tied up in this image that he pushes out really far about Russia's new power abroad and this, that, and the other thing. And if we really do, that's why I think that's why I think everyone was so invested in covering up the fact that we killed a couple hundred Russian soldiers, Russian contractors last month. Because if we really do puncture that illusion that Putin has brought Russia back to primacy and brought him back, then he could fall. And I think that what would come next might be more hyper-nationalist, might be more problematic. I don't really know. I think I've probably overmade claims in the past about Russia falling apart. I don't know. I mean, we sort of see stuff like that in Chechnya and Ingushetia. Sorry, but I don't know about Russia actually falling apart. But the prospect of Russia having a more hyper-nationalist government seems high to me. Okay. Question. Pakistan just sent troops to Saudi Arabia even though the move was not taken by their government. Is Pakistan a client state of Saudi? That's a fascinating question. I didn't. Was that really done without the approval of the Pakistani government? I would be surprised. Because Pakistan absolutely has, I don't know, calling Pakistan a client of Saudi Arabia is probably overblown. But the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan is of long standing and not reciprocal. What I did find very interesting was that Saudi Arabia tried to get Pakistani military forces to join them in Yemen, and the Pakistani government was like, no, that's not going to happen. Because I'd read articles about Pakistan sending troops, and my understanding was that the Pakistani government had sent those troops with the understanding that they not be used for foreign policy. The article I read seemed to give the impression that they were meant to be sort of like a palace guard for MBS and his faction, because Saudi, MBS is forcing a lot of changes in Saudi Arabia and needs to be, I think, legitimately worried about his personal safety. So I think that's what those guys might have been used for. Sorry, they're for training officially. I guess they'd have to have people who wanted to be trained. Yeah. So I don't. Did Pakistan really go without? I don't think those troops went to Saudi. I don't think those Pakistani troops went to Saudi Arabia without government approval. So yeah. Could the UK and the EU become rivals after Brexit? Asked Persian Immortal. Yes and no. The UK and the EU will become rivals after Brexit. B, yeah, absolutely. But is rival really the appropriate term? I think that it'll be in the EU's interest to punish the UK for leaving, and I don't know that the UK has a lot of weight to pull. I think that the UK is going to be absolutely at the absolute minimum in a 5 to 10 year fury to sort of just establish the ground rules that are blown out by the EU. I mean, they've got to renegotiate trade treaties. They got to figure out how they're going to handle. I think everything from their nuclear agency to the amount of stuff that the British have to put back together over 5 years to then go begin to compete with EU on a not at all even playing field with an economy that is 1/10 the size of the EU. Yeah, I don't think rivals is the appropriate term. I think the UK's only hope is the United States or other Commonwealth countries forming tighter relationships with them. But why would the Commonwealth countries be more interested in the UK, which is 1/10 the size of the EU, and the United States is currently run by a deranged, orange-faced lunatic who spends his time, reacts to terror attacks in London by getting in fights with London's mayor. Yeah, I'm not very optimistic about the UK after Brexit. My hope is that it would, miraculously just give up on this terrible idea, but we'll see. That's not going to happen. All right. Questions. Persian guy, who do you think will replace Netanyahu? Probably a worse person, right? That's a great question, man. Israel makes me sad. Who will replace Netanyahu? Don't know. Just don't know. I need to read up more on Netanyahu and Israel generally, and finally get over my my fear of covering the country. But yeah, I just don't. As I've covered before, I sort of consciously avoid talking about Israel because I feel like if I say something that's pro-Israel, I'm going to piss off a lot of my foreign audience. If I say something that's anti-Israel, I'm going to piss off a lot of my U.S. audience. So I'm a bit cowardly covering it. But so I honestly don't even read that much about the country. I know Netanyahu is currently under investigation, or actually has he been, I think there's a court case ongoing or something, but I don't I can't speak to the internal politics, nor should I. I mean, like, Israel is what, 7 million people? Like should be about as interesting as Albania. Obviously, that's not the case. But anyway, Joseph Jagusa asks, specifically, is Trump emphasizing our military might and productive power to undermine our trade and diplomatic strength? I don't know if that's his conscious emphasis, but yes, that is that is the result, and it's really dumb and makes me very sad. I don't think Trump acknowledges that our trade and diplomatic weight exists, which is really unfortunate. I think our tremendous military dominance, which has absolutely existed, is something that's going to fade over the course of my working life, not even the course of my lifetime. It's going to, yeah, it's certainly already fading relatively, and we're going to reach some point of fiscal crisis in the next 3 or 4 decades where it's going to have to fall in real terms as well. And our trade and diplomatic stuff is like, this is there's a metaphor from my sporting days, but like our trade and diplomatic influence, like the UN, the WTO, all these institutions we've created, that's the place where we've deposited, like, that's the bank where we've deposited all of these years of dominance. That's what we've invested in. That sort of structure that Trump has no respect for or interest in. That's our retirement policy. You know, that's actually a good metaphor. I should maybe make that video. Like, that is our retirement policy. The WTO, the UN, the liberal international order is our retirement policy. We've been putting 70 years of military dominance behind that. To see Trump piss all over that right now is one of my greatest problems with him as a president. So yeah, I think that's very apt. I think that's a very good way of looking at it. That Trump is emphasizing our military and productive power to undermine our trade and diplomatic strength. Though I would question whether he really is doing anything for our productive power either. I think he's signing a few brief, dumb deals. Questions? Oh, okay. Persian guy says, I did some research and I think current education minister will be the next prime minister. You can begin from him and I get why you avoid Israel. So yeah, Persian guy says that the current education minister is likely to be the next prime minister of Israel. I'm honestly pleased to hear that Netanyahu is really on his way out. My impression of Israel has gotten more and more banana republic. It's nice to see that they're still a place that can kick out a criminal president. That's nice to see. Which was also very nice to see in South Africa recently. That was an exciting thing to see Zuma go. Rashid Betha says 2025 will be the end of the American empire. I think that's a little early. I think depends on a million different things what you're talking about with American empire. But for the U.S. to reach a legitimate crisis point by 2025, we would need a financial crisis that made 2008 look tiny. And the weird thing about financial crises is that they also tend to hit everybody else pretty hard. So yeah, 2025 I think is probably way too early as a date for the end of the American empire. What I think is very possible, and people shouldn't tell themselves that the American empire will end without a war, because I'd like to avoid that, but that's certainly the most likely way for American empire to end. So we shouldn't be talking about the end of American empire. We should be talking about World War III. And I think World War III is something that's 2 to 3 to 5 decades from now, when the rest of the world is at a point of relative wealth where they really could take on the U.S. Obviously, like, sort of the whole point of this YouTube channel is to avoid that moment. But so yeah, 2025 is a little too early. Why don't you talk about the incident of Djibouti and Ali Salah asks, why don't you talk about the incident of Djibouti and Somalia kicking the UAE from their ports? Huh, interesting. Not aware of it. Something I should look into. Djibouti is kind of a fascinating little country. China has, I think, now one overseas military base, and it is in Djibouti. It's in a city in Djibouti. Is it Djibouti City or something like that? And on the other side of this city in Djibouti is a U.S. military base. It's just, if you're looking for an important place for World War III to start, that would be why. Yeah, Djibouti's, it's fascinating to me. I sort of looked into that. I was like, how? Djibouti is tiny, and it has both U.S. and Chinese bases in the same city, which is kind of interesting. But I am not. I need to actually read a lot more about the UAE and its influence. I think there's a lot that's fascinating that I don't completely grasp about what's going on in Yemen, what's going on in Somalia, thanks to the UAE. So yeah, that's a good thing to call up, but I can't really answer that question. What is the end game between China and Taiwan? Will the PRC ever invade? Is peaceful unification possible? I think peaceful unification is what's going to happen at some point this century. I hope. Because the alternative is violent unification. I did a video a while back, sort of like, what was it? Will Trump go to war with China? Made that about a year ago. And I think it's important to say that in like 2100, there's no question in my mind that, provided, you know, World War III hasn't happened and we're not fighting with rocks, if China, if from the United States, that's a good way of looking at it, Asia and China is something we're still aware of. If our circle of awareness goes beyond the next valley over in 2100, then China will be in charge of it. That goes without saying. Whether it happens in what I would consider to be vastly preferable is it happens through a peaceful unification in the context of the existing world system that the U.S. has built and has now become more useful for powers like China, India, the rest of the world. You know, maybe one country, three systems. I expect China to change dramatically by 2100. And hopefully, yes, it comes about a sort of peaceful unification. China is too big and too invested in the idea of reclaiming Taiwan for it to not happen. So it can either happen peacefully or it can happen through a major war. I'd much rather it happen peacefully. So yeah, that's my take on Taiwan. 2008 crisis didn't hurt China or India that bad, though. From Logo Cool Extreme. That's actually not entirely true. China, India, can't speak to in much detail, but 2008 in China is interesting. If you look at the GDP growth, it did fall off a bit, but what they did to maintain that is something that's still biting them in the ass today. So what China did in the 2008 crisis was engage in a massive program of stimulus, which involved a lot of going into a lot of I don't know if it's sovereign debt so much, but definitely involved a lot of private sector debt. So there's this tremendous overhang in the Chinese economy. I think that's actually one of the challenges for China that is cited now, was the potential for a massive debt crisis. And it was actually their stimulus after 2008, which kept their economy going and could very well have been worthwhile. Could have been the right thing to do, because there was, as you said, there wasn't a big dip in China. There wasn't a big crisis or unseating of power in China after the crisis in 2008. But that debt is still something that China has to deal with. So it did hurt China, actually. As far as India, I can't speak to that bit of economic history. Okay. Do we have any questions? Any final questions? I think I'm probably going to wrap up here. Anyway, thank you so much for showing up. Sorry I couldn't do produced videos on all of these topics. It's a lot happening. There's been a lot happening, and I kind of like doing this live update thing. It was cool to get out there, chat with you folks, and deal with a bunch of topics I wouldn't have been able to deal with either. I wouldn't have been able to deal with otherwise. Do you guys like this? Do you guys think this is useful? Do you guys think I should do this maybe a little more often? I probably wouldn't do it more than once a month, but I do think it's kind of useful to cover a bunch of issues. And also, I really like this live chat. I love it, where we seem to have lost the shit posters. You guys are asking really great questions. You're reminding me that I need to look into the UAE. But yeah, if you guys have any thoughts on this format or whatnot, why not let me know, not just in the chat, but in the comments on this video, which will pop up on the page in the next 15 minutes after I end it. Thank you so much. My name is Robert Morris. I run the More Freedom Foundation. My goal is to avert World War III by promoting knowledge of foreign policy, both in the United States and abroad, and trying to build connections across borders, sing Kumbaya, this, that, and the other thing. Currently, I put up a video every Tuesday at my YouTube channel, the More Freedom Foundation, which you're watching right now. You can click on that little More Freedom Foundation there and bring you to the rest of my videos. Coming up on Tuesday, we'll be dealing with Catalan independence and its significance relating to the current weakness of the European Union. I am writing a book called Avoiding the British Empire, which really needs to get done in the next couple months, talking about how the U.S. empire can learn from the lessons of the fall of the British Empire, and we can hopefully end up transitioning to the next cycle of power in the world without World War III. And I am on Twitter at RoboLaw. I am on Instagram at The Golden Age. I am on Patreon. This work is primarily supported by patrons, folks who chip in between $1 and $15. Thank you, Mark Bowler, per video. And that's what keeps me eating, and among other things. Anyway, I'm clearly a bit scattered. Thank you all for tuning in. You guys are the best. And yes, I am in NYC. I have found a very cheap place to stay in New York City. And I tend to film at my parents' place in the suburbs, which is necessary, as you can tell from the sound coming through. All right. I think I'm about done here, unless there are any final questions. Looks like we're okay. Thanks so much for watching. Check me out on all of my media empire, and all the best. Where do I turn this off? And let me stop it.